Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you today by Tate of Portugal. Dress for the life you want at tateofportugal.com. Again, that is tateofportugal.com. Welcome to the podcast. It is Tuesday, and it's, December 27th. We are almost at the end of the year, but I have another author interview for you, of course, today, and this is very exciting. This is my 300th author interview. I did not know that when I was interviewing Sue, so I didn't have a chance to tell her. So, Sue, thank you so much for being my 300th interview. That's pretty awesome. Maybe not for you, but it's pretty awesome for me. So thank you. I just randomly decided to look the other day and see how many I had done, and it turned out that this is the 300th. So very cool. Thank you, as always, for being with me on this journey. Today's interview is with author Sue Mell about her novel Provenance. Let me go ahead and give you the description of that book. Still grieving his wife's early death, DJ has spent the last 3 years and the money from her insurance policy collecting guitars, composing music, and continuing to shop the Brooklyn stoop sales and flea markets they'd always enjoyed. When his building is sold, he takes refuge in his younger sister's half-finished basement, imagining a comfortable and solitary retreat in Hurley, the small Hudson Valley town where they grew up. Instead, he finds himself caught up in her troubling divorce, drafted as caregiver for his 11-year-old niece, and unable to face or afford a storage unit crammed with hundreds of vinyl records and every other scrap of his former life. DJ gifts his niece a marbled glass egg, a pork pie hat, and one of his prized guitars. But what's asked of him on his return to Hurley is not to give the perfect object, it's to give of himself. So that is, again, Provenance by Sue Mell. It's a character-driven story. It's a story about relationships. It is a story about returning to your hometown, returning to your roots in some ways, returning to a place that maybe once was home and in some ways still feels like home but isn't, returning to a place where you were a different person, as we all kind of are when we go back to the places we grew up, especially if you grew up in one town, in one house, etc. I've gone home before, and it's always both very comforting and very, very weird because it is not at all the same. So DJ he's in some ways very complicated and in other ways very simple. He's very simple in that he has kind of stopped making decisions after his wife's death. He just kind of doesn't feel like it's kind of a why bother? What does it matter sort of thing. He goes through her life insurance in 3 years. But he's complicated in that there's a lot going on in his head, and there's a lot of things that he actually has to deal with once he moves into his sister's basement, which doesn't sound like, that's not one of those upward moves. Literally, you're moving down into a basement, but it really does force him to confront some of the things that he has just been avoiding after his wife's death. And so he has to come to terms with some things, and that gets a little complicated for him. But it is definitely a character-driven novel. We talk about this a little bit, but I really appreciated the relationship he has with his niece. She is 11, and she is opinionated in the way that 11-year-olds can be. They are they're still kids. They're getting close to being teenagers. They still have that brutal honesty sometimes. And he he and his niece do have quite a fun, quirky relationship, and I appreciated that. You know, being the auntie of 5 nieces myself, I definitely can appreciate a good niece relationship. So let's go ahead and turn to the interview. Again, Provenance by Sue Mell.
Hi, Sue. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here on this. We are close to Christmas, although this will come out after Christmas, but you are taking time from your pre-Christmas or pre-holidays, depending on what you celebrate. So I appreciate you taking the time. Before we talk about the book Provenance, if you could share a little bit about yourself, just so we can all get to know you a little bit, that would be great.
Sure. I grew up in New York, in Queens. I moved to Manhattan after college, where I had nothing to do with writing. I majored in ceramics and painting. And then I moved out to California, to San Francisco in 1991. And I worked as a freelance illustrator for many, many years. And I also worked as a freelance bed stylist, which is the person who in catalogs and websites who makes bedding and linens and tablecloths, makes everything look great for photography. Let's see what else. In 2018, I moved back to New York to become the primary caregiver for my mom, who has dementia. And that's where I've been, and that's where I've been writing from. That's where I wrote this version of the novel. That gives you a brief survey.
Yeah, it's hard to encapsulate a whole life into a couple minutes. So thank you. You did great.
I don't know. Was that okay, or is that like weird?
And actually, I'm fascinated by the bed stylist, because now you know all the tricks and tips for, making them look so fluffy and inviting.
Yes, but it's all like bricks and pins and clamps and fiberfill. It's nothing you would want to actually sit on or lie
I was
in.
imagining. Yeah. So if you were to do that at home, you would not want to actually get in that bed.
No.
Well, the book is called Provenance. Can you give an overview of the story?
Yeah. I think of Provenance as a story of hope and ruin. The main character is DJ, and he's trying to salvage his life after he's moved back to the small town in upstate New York where he grew up. It's a move that's complicated by a couple of things. He's now living in the half-finished basement of his younger sister, who's going through a messy divorce. He's still very much grieving the loss of his wife, who died from cancer 3 years before. And because he's run through all the money from her insurance policy, he can't even afford the nearby storage unit that holds his collection of records and every other scrap of his former life. And so that's where the story begins.
What was your initial inspiration for the story?
It was twofold. On a technical level, I was inspired by a story by the writer Robert Boswell, which is called No River Wide. It's an amazing story that does all kinds of different things. But what I was most interested in was the way that it ends. It's not a happy ending for the main character, but there is a kind of lift in the final page and an opening into a future of possibility, not for the main character, but for her daughter. So it's a transiting of generations. And I was interested in that idea, especially because most of what I was writing ended with a downward spiral. And so I wanted to see if I could write something that ended on a different note. And then on an emotional level, I had a friend whose wife died, and he was living off the money from her insurance and heedlessly running through it. And we fell out about that time permanently. But I took that premise and then I tried to imagine what his life would be like when that money finally ran out.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I can see those influences.
It's time for our first break, but I said it was interesting, and it is. I really like taking that approach because a lot of people would maybe start writing from the perspective of what does he do with that money, and how is he dealing with the grief after the loss of his wife, and kind of going through that money, but taking the approach of what does he do now that the money's run out. I think that's a very different and, again, interesting way to approach this story, and a different entry point into the story. So let's go ahead and take our first break of the episode. When we come back, Sue will be talking a little bit more about DJ as the main character, so stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Sue Mell about her novel Provenance.
In terms of DJ, he's human. I don't know. I didn't always feel like he was making great choices, but who does? What about him as a character do you think will resonate with readers?
Well, I think it's a story about starting over reluctantly. And I think that's something that many of us go through. You know, our lives are not in our control. Things happen. And, you know, I myself, as I was rewriting this book, had totally upended my life and moved back to New York unexpectedly. I never planned to move. My mom fell and I got on a plane and I never ended up going back. But coming back to DJ, I think the tenderness of the bond that he develops with his 11-year-old niece is something that's really touching, or that I hope is touching. And he's a guy who's managed to get other people to take care of him his entire life. But now then he's tasked with a crucial part of her care. We see his ability to really get who she is and to empathize with her emotional losses. And this ultimately moves him to rise above all the failures of responsibilities that he's been so prone to in his own life. So it's not so much a redemption for him per se, but she offers him a chance to be, you know, he has a chance to be significant and a significant person in her life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we see the best version of him in that relationship.
Yes.
And so that's his niece. He's living with his niece and his sister. The book is written from his point of view, but we also see Connie and Elise through his eyes. But they're pretty significant to the story as well. So can you talk a little bit about those relationships? You've touched on niece and uncle, but can you just talk about how those relationships influence his story?
Well, his sister is kind of like the anti-DJ. She's the opposite of him. But they also, when they were young, they had a very tight bond, and they bonded over music and being the younger siblings in a larger family. And she was kind of wild, you know, in her youth, but then she grew up to be this sort of uber responsible social worker, working at a state hospital. But she ended up marrying someone who was kind of a wreck. And, you know, I think that's another thing. So many of us have a blind spot, you know, when it comes to our own significant relationship, in a marriage or a romantic. I'm not sure if that actually answered your question.
I think it touched on it. I would follow it up with the characters in this book are very human, which is, that's good because people are human, generally speaking, I think.
Yes.
When it comes to your characters and developing those characters, did you have a pretty good idea of how those characters looked before you started writing, or did you let them evolve as you wrote, or a combination thereof?
A combination thereof. Each was initially based on someone that I knew of, so I had a starting point. Connie was based on a friend who was at one point in her life for many years a social worker at a state hospital, and who was married to a guy who had a serious coke problem. And then Elise is based on the daughter of a woman I knew in California, who was a single mom, and she was just a really smart, feisty kid, and her life was kind of hard. She was expected to be a grown-up in many ways and to fend for herself. And so those were the starting points for Elise. But then I am one of those writers who kind of sits with a scene in her head. I mean, when I used to hear people talk about this, about running, seeing a movie in their head, I was like, yeah, right. Except it turns out that I am one of those people. I kind of picture a scene and then I try to sink into it and have the characters there, and I'm listening for what it is that they might say to each other, and things kind of evolve from there.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. How about your own experiences? So your circumstances aren't the same, but you have experience of moving home when you didn't expect it. Did you include any of your own kind of autobiographical elements in the story or the characters?
Oddly, it was the reverse, that I wrote the novel and then those things happened. It was like life imitating art. But it's true that as I wrote the first draft of this book, I started in graduate school and finished a full draft afterwards in about 2017, and was started sending it around to agents, querying agents, and got very little response of any kind. And then I applied for a fellowship at SUNY Stony Brook called Bookends. And that's a 1-year mentorship for revising the full draft of a novel. And in that fellowship, I ended up rewriting the entire draft. I only kept 2 very short scenes and maybe a total of 2,000 words, some description and some of DJ's interior monologue. And everything else was rewritten from scratch.
Wow. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, no, I was going to say, but during that time, I was in New York and my stuff was all sitting out in my apartment in San Francisco, which I could not sublet. And so I did have that same kind of weight on my own head of like, what am I going to do with all my stuff?
I understand that feeling.
Yeah, which is a driving point in the plot of the novel. It's not a very plotty novel, but the plot it's much more about relationships and character. It's a character-driven book.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was going to say the kind of revamping. I mean, it was a major overhaul. Was that cathartic? Was it scary? How did you approach that process?
Definitely scary. It was terrifying. And I was lucky to have the support of you start with the first half of the year, you work with 2 other pod mates, 2 other writers. And then in the second half of the year, you still have your pod, but you also have a single mentor that you work with, who's a established writer. And I had the great good fortune to work with Amy Hempel. So that was amazing.
Good. It sounds like that would be a much easier process to go through with good support.
Yeah. No, I can't imagine doing it that. I don't think I would have been able to just decide to do that and do that on my own. It was it's only done under duress. And under advisement, I came to see that it was correct. In the initial draft, there was a whole section in the middle where he goes back to Brooklyn, and in the first workshop for bookends, Susie Merrill said to me, "That's not him going back to Brooklyn. That's you. That's me, the writer, bunting and going back to something that I know because I don't know what to do next." She was like, "Just take that section out." But once I took that section out, to me, everything else unraveled, and I could only see just starting over.
Painfully, brutally honest, but in the end, helpful.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's a much better book.
It's time for our second break, but whenever I hear stories like that, I completely project. I project my own feelings, of course, onto the experience and think, yeah, I probably would have just cried. This is probably why I'm not an author, because I would cry. Well, you know what? I would cry, and then I would probably take the advice and do what I could, and maybe rewrite the whole thing as Sue did. But there would definitely be crying in the beginning. So good on you for all of you authors who have the courage to massively overhaul or even rewrite stories and make them better, different. But having the courage to do that is pretty impressive. Anyway, we are going to take the second break. When we come back, Sue will be talking about writing character-driven stories. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
They say you should dress for the job you want, not the job you have. So why not dress for the life you want too? Tate of Portugal has the high-end European designer clothing and casual wear you're looking for. Show the world you're enjoying paradise with the clothes you wear. Whether you're at the beach, the golf course, or pulling away in your dream car. Live life to the fullest and dress like it with clothes from Tate of Portugal. Shop now at tateofportugal.com.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Sue Mell about her novel, Provenance. Let's go ahead and return to the interview.
What is it about character-driven stories, do you think, that draws you to write within that genre?
That's a good question. I've always been interested in the subtle and intimate dynamics of relationships, and I'm drawn to those kind of pivotal moments in a conversation where things just suddenly shift. That interests me, and that's something that I try to recreate in my own work, because things so suddenly go awry from driven by a gesture or a single word or a snide remark. So I guess I'm interested in sort of the psychology of characters and relationship and how that plays out. Um, and and there's a thing people used to say about going to the theater. I laughed, I cried, I fell in love. And I'm always looking for that. And I think that's much easier to create by character rather than action per se. Although, of course, you want to have action and you want your characters to be active and to be engaging. You want something to happen in a book for it to, and something needs to happen for it to be satisfying for a reader.
Yeah, although I have read books where it felt like nothing happened, and they are hard.
Yeah.
Are you working on anything new currently?
Right now I'm working on something. I'm not sure what it is, if it's going to be stories or a novel. Just kind of trying to plow my way in. It revolves around, it's tentatively titled Such Good Friends. And it's addresses questions of loyalty and kind of emotional debt within friendships, and the failure of friendships and the success of others. So that's a very general idea, but that's kind of what I'm focusing on, and we'll see how that plays out. But other than that, I just signed a contract with She Writes Press for a story collection that's going to come out in fall of 2024, and that's tentatively titled A New Day.
Wonderful. You mentioned that you went to school not for writing. So what eventually drove you to write for publication, or even just starting to write for yourself and then writing for publication?
Well, I was always a big reader, and I particularly liked short stories. And I did, in my early 30s, take a writing class. And I thought, oh, yeah, this is way too hard. I can't do this. And I also felt like the writing, I've always done a lot of different creative things, visual arts and other performing arts. But writing always seemed to me the most isolated. You spend so much time by yourself. And because I didn't have I didn't major in English, I didn't have any kind of education in that regard. I just thought, it's too hard, too lonely. And then in my early 50s, I was living a fairly isolated, I mean, not isolated is a strong word, but I was pretty much to myself, working in a kind of a homebody. And I thought, why not try? But it was actually kind of a weird wending journey through a ridiculous set of circumstances. I ended up pursuing stand-up for a couple of years, which was how I started writing and how I developed the discipline of writing on a daily basis. And then I ended up doing some work in doing independent pieces for radio, and I had to write narration for those. So nonfiction initially felt like something I could do, very short pieces. And then I briefly had a podcast, very briefly, it's about 7 episodes. I think it's still out there somewhere, called Unintended Detours. And in doing that, there was interviews with different people on a theme, and then I would write a short piece sort of for the middle of it. But it got hard to find, and this was at the beginning of the whole podcast era. I had troubles, I would book somebody to talk to them, somebody that I knew. I'd heard them tell a story at lunch on a gig. But then when I put a mic in front of their face, they would freak out. And I was like, oh, I could just do this myself. I could just write fiction instead. And then I could just stay home and do this by myself. And then I started taking classes and pursuing writing and moving forward from there. Very weird story, right?
As we go into the final break of the podcast, I will say, yeah, it might be kind of a weird story, but I like weird stories. I think people's weird stories are often the most interesting, and the ways that they come at different parts of their life from different angles and different directions than somebody else might just makes life and stories and experiences that much more interesting. So let's go ahead and take that final break. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Sue Mell. If you remember, right before the break, she was talking about how she came to write for publication, and she said it's kind of a weird story. So I just wanted to refresh your memory on that, because my response will make more sense as we jump back into the interview with Sue.
Everyone's path is different, so I like that you came at it from a different angle. And from your experiences, do you have advice maybe for someone who has thought about writing, but maybe they were also kind of thinking, no, I can't do this?
I would say start small. That's what I did, especially now. I mean, flash and micro fiction and nonfiction is really a thriving genre. I mean, genre is not really the right word, but there are a lot of options available for publication on the web, and as well as in print, and take some classes or a workshop and put your best work out there. I have a very good friend who's a really talented writer, but she has such a fear of submitting her work. You got to put yourself out there, and a lot of venues offer for very small nominal feedback. That's a great way to get information about how your work is going if you don't have a particular community of writers. But again, that's also, I mean, community is such a overused word, but you do need to have other writers that, to find readers for your work who you trust and whose feedback you can handle. To be there for all the many rejections that you're going to get, but also to be there for the successes that are, with perseverance, eventually going to come your way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. You said you are an avid reader. So when you take the time to read for yourself, what are your go-to authors and genres?
I always have a hard time. I was like, who's your favorite author? I don't know.
Me too. I do the same thing. Whoever reading at the time, maybe.
Yeah. So I would still say that my favorite authors are, from years ago, still are Ann Beatty and Raymond Carver. More currently, I'm interested in collaged work. So let's see, on my stack of things that I'm looking at, that I've read multiple times. I have Improvement by Joan Silber, which is a perfect book to my way of thinking. I loved Emily St. John Mandel's The Glass Hotel. That's a book where she just goes from character to character and moves through time with such freedom. It's a really great book. What else am I reading? Filthy Animals by Brandon Taylor. And a collection of stories by Amy Bloom, which is called Where the God of Love Hangs Out. And recently I really love Jhumpa Lahiri's novel. I think it's about a year or two old. and that is called Whereabouts. So kind of an obscure little list there, but
It's
not
your
entirely.
list, so it can be whatever
It's
you
my
want it to
list.
be.
Yeah. Yeah, cut that obscure thing. That was weird. That's a weird remark.
How about internet presence? So website, any social media you're active on?
Yeah, you can find all my stuff at SueMellWrites.com. That's SueMell. I'm on Twitter, such as it is, if it's still going to exist in the next year, and Instagram. I am on Facebook, but that's I have a writer profile on Facebook. But yeah, those are the places to find me. My website, you can find links to past work and a couple of craft essays and other interviews about the novel Provenance. I also write short nonfiction, and I've published a chapbook about caring for my mom called Giving Care. So you can find out more about that on the website as well.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Sue, we've talked about a few things during this time, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to highlight?
I'd love to say that I did the artwork for the cover of Provenance. So that was a really nice full circle. I got to include, my past as an illustrator into my present as a writer. That was a really lucky thing. One of the benefits of working with an independent press, that I had the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Not every author gets to be that involved.
Yes, usually you don't even necessarily have a say, let alone have the opportunity to do the artwork itself.
Yeah, wonderful, and it's beautiful. I love all the colors. So
thank you.
Nicely done. Well, again, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
And thank you again to Sue for not only taking the time right before Christmas to talk to me about her book, but also for being my 300th interview, which neither of us knew at the time. But thank you, Sue, for that. I appreciate it, and just kind of a fun little milestone that you got to be a part of. So I appreciate that. If you are a fan of character-driven novels, of stories of homecoming and the ways that those can go in directions that characters are not always expecting, and the ways that they sometimes can go in the directions that they are expecting, but character-related or character-driven, relationship-driven story of family and homecoming, then you should definitely check out Provenance. And hey, maybe you are a late gift giver. It happens to me regularly. You might still be looking for something for holiday gift giving, and this might be a good choice for you. I promise I'll stop talking about giving. No, maybe not. I'll probably still talk about gift giving in some ways, but maybe not quite as intensely as I have been the last few weeks. But there's always gift giving opportunities, right? I talked to my nieces yesterday, and of course we had to talk about the books that they got for Christmas. And one of them was like, I only got one book for Christmas this year, and she was very disgusted, and I was disgusted on her behalf. But I have not gotten her a book for Christmas yet either. So see, I am also late. At any rate, thank you to Sue. Thank you, as always, to you. I hope you will join me for my next interview. I will be speaking with Randy Minkler, returning from character-driven, and prior to that, if you notice, December was a lot of thrillers and psychological mysteries and suspense, and so it's been nice. We've moved into a different direction for this week and next week. This week, of course, character-driven, and then next week we are turning to sci-fi, fantasy, apocalyptic kind of genre. Author Randy Minkler, and his book, The Redeemed. So join me for that. In the meantime, as always, if you're a fan of this podcast, do me some favors. Like, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you listen to the podcast on. That way you'll always get new episodes when they come out. Reviews are wonderful. That would be a really great end of the year present to the podcast. If you could leave a review, written or starred, just like your favorite authors, hopefully you're leaving them reviews as well, because just helps everybody immensely all around, gets the podcast out to more book lovers. So I would greatly appreciate that. And if you're of a mind and you're on social media, follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Love hearing from listeners, finding out more about what's going on with you. So find me, follow the podcast, tell me what you've been up to. In the meantime, it is almost the end of another year. And actually, the next episode will be next year. That is crazy. I just realized that. That is just not normal. But next episode will be next year. And so I hope you have a wonderful, safe, happy New Year's. And maybe you go out and party, or maybe you just stay home and read a good book. I vote for the second, but that's always just me. But regardless, I hope that the next week and all of next year affords you plenty of time to get yourself lost in lots and lots and lots of amazing books. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.